It's just hard to say. My mother took it to her grave. My father took it to the grave. And what's strange to me is that of my two other brothers, because they're the only ones who are existent now, even to this day, no one ever talked about it. I'm the one who still to this day, probably daily, if not searching, looking, trying to do something to this day, 55 years, and I was barely, 3 years old.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Across State Lines. I'm your host, Danielle. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the podcast. And just as a reminder, Across State Lines is now on all podcast streaming platforms, so please follow us wherever you listen. And if you'd like to leave us a rating or a review, it would be greatly appreciated. Today, we are going to dive into the case of 10-year-old Bobby Boyes, who disappeared the day after Christmas from his hometown of Port Republic, Maryland in 1968, after walking home from a friend's house with his beloved pet deer, Pete. When Pete arrived back to the boy's home with his leash and collar still attached, but Bobby was nowhere to be found, a search organization was quickly formed, but sadly, there has been no traces of Bobby since the day he went missing. I originally wrote about this case on Reddit while searching for a Maryland case for my state-by-state series, and after stumbling upon Bobby's Charlie Project page during my research, his page is one that has stuck with me for two reasons. One being that Bobby was spending an innocent day visiting his friends with his favorite pet deer the day after celebrating the Christmas holiday, and two, because Bobby happens to bear a striking resemblance to my own 9-year-old son. I've had the privilege of being able to speak to Bobby's younger sister, Joy, and it is evident how much his disappearance has affected her over the years, and how desperate she is to be able to bring her older brother home to the family. Being able to shine a light on little-known cases that otherwise don't often get highlighted in the news is something that is very important to me, and I knew that as soon as I started this podcast, that Bobby's case is one of the very first ones that I wanted to cover. So with that being said, let's jump into the case of Bobby Boyes. Bob Louis Richard Boyes, affectionately known as Bobby to those who knew and loved him, was born on February 10, 1958, to his parents Jane and Richard Boyes. Bobby was one of 5 children, and the family comprised of 3 boys and 2 girls. And in the late 1960s, the family had resided in a rural area of Port Republic, Maryland. The boys' property was on 10 acres of land, which sat a 2-story home and a mobile home, and the family of 7 would stay in the mobile home during the winters in order to save money on heating, and then would move back into the 2-story home in the summers, where they could open windows and let the breeze in. Bobby's sister, Joy, described Bobby as a gentle, loving, innocent child who enjoyed spending his time exploring the outdoors with his pet deer, Pete. Joy did not know how Bobby had acquired Pete, but she said that Bobby and Pete shared the same mild-mannered nature and were often seen together, with Bobby walking Pete on a metal chain. Joy, who was 3 years old at the time of Bobby's disappearance, stated that she was closest to Bob out of her 3 brothers because of how gentle and mild-mannered he was. She said that she appreciated that he didn't roughhouse like the other boys, and that her and Bobby spent a lot of time playing together. On Christmas Day of 1968, the day before Bobby's disappearance, the family spent the morning opening gifts and sharing quality time together to celebrate the holiday. In one of her last memories with her brother, Joy recalled sitting with Bobby while he played with his new Fort Apache toy set, and she sat behind him, playing with his hair. She recalled in an interview that all of her brothers had buzz cuts at the time, and that she spent the afternoon sitting behind Bobby, giving it her best attempt to comb his very short hair. This was the last time that Joy would ever play with her older brother. That Christmas, Bobby received a gift that was very special to him, a brand new pocket watch. Once Bobby received this watch, he carried it around with him everywhere. Despite only owning it for one day before his disappearance, it was said that this watch did not leave Bobby's side. The next day, December 26th, Bobby dressed in a plaid shirt, dark pants, brown leather boots, and a dark coat with $2 in his pocket, and left with his two brothers to visit their nearby friends, the five Hance brothers. Assuming how he felt about his new pocket watch, it's probable that Bobby kept it tucked safely in his pocket when he left the house. The three boys walked the mile to the Hance home along Wash Hance Road, named after the family who lived there. The boys played with the Hance brothers for much of the morning, all showing off their new Christmas toys, and by the time that lunch rolled around, Bobby's brothers were ready to go home and eat. Bobby, however, wanted to stay longer, so the boys said goodbye to each other and made their way home. Shortly after, a neighbor who was washing dishes in her kitchen spotted Bobby walking along the road with Pete in tow. The neighbor stated that she watched Bobby and Pete walk along the street before they rounded a corner and were out of her line of sight. Pete would arrive at the boys' home, metal chains still looped around his neck, but Bobby was nowhere to be found. When speaking to a local news outlet, Bobby's sister Joy, who was 3 at the time of his disappearance, stated, quote, "So this is the story, you know. Bobby wanted to stay longer to play with the Hance boys, and it was still light outside, so the brothers came home on their way. And apparently, I don't know exactly, maybe an hour and 15 minutes later, he left the house, the Hance boys' house, and the neighbor had said that she had watched him through the kitchen window walking the street with his pet deer Pete until she couldn't see him any longer." End quote. When Bobby didn't arrive home for lunch, the family wasn't immediately worried. They assumed that Bobby had stayed out exploring the creeks and the outdoors, which Bobby loved to do. However, when dinner rolled around and Bobby still wasn't back, Jane and Richard began to grow concerned. The temperature that day was in the low 20s, and with the sun going down, the temperature was going to drop considerably. At 7:30 p.m., Richard and Jane called the police to report their 10-year-old son missing. Once police arrived, a search for Bobby began immediately. Authorities and volunteer searchers combed the woods around the property until 1:30 in the morning, and having found no trace of Bobby, the search was called off until the next day. The search resumed again at 9:30 the next morning, and it was thorough. A helicopter was brought in, wells and wood piles were sifted through, lakes and ponds were dug, and a 5-mile radius around the home was searched. Nothing pointed to where Bobby had gone, however. Neighbors were also spoken to, and it was discovered that the neighbor in the trailer had seen Bobby rounding the corner with Pete in tow. Another neighbor who had lived near the property stated that he had been at work all day and then slept on his farm that night, so he hadn't seen anything regarding Bobby the day before. The search continued for 5 days, but came up empty-handed. Police stated that they did not believe that Bobby's body, had he been killed, could have been buried as the ground was frozen solid that time of year, and that if he was in a body of water, his body would have surfaced. 100 volunteers, the town's fire department, the Army Reserves, and the family searched for 4 to 5 days, but no trace of Bobby was ever uncovered. Joy said this about Bobby's disappearance and the search efforts. Quote, "I'll forever remember the response from the search team that Bobby disappeared in thin air, without a trace. How does that happen? Walking home from the neighbor's house with his pet deer. His deer comes home, but without him." End quote. With little to go on, authorities began to dig deeper into Bobby's home and school life. Bobby's teacher was spoken to, and she claimed that Bobby was a good student and a wonderful child. However, she told authorities that Bobby would often come to school visibly dirty, and that she would ask him to clean up in the bathroom before starting the day. Looking at Bobby's home and parents, a few concerning things were discovered in the early days of the investigation. It was noted that both parents, Richard and Jane, had tempers, and that they had a problem with drinking. It was also stated that Jane had hit the children before. When speaking to family members, Richard's stepfather, Clarence, told a disturbing story. A few years prior to the family moving to the 10-acre lot, Richard had asked his stepfather and mother, Valerie, for money to purchase the land. Valerie told him no, that she would not be giving him the money, and this led to a temporary fallout between mother and son. After some time went by, and Richard purchased the property on his own, Valerie and Clarence would visit Richard, Jane, and the children to see their new house. After having a few beers with Richard, Clarence had wanted to clear the air of the tensions between them. He explained to Richard why Valerie did not want to give him the money. He had often borrowed money to purchase things, and when he stopped making payments, he would dump the debt onto the other parties. Hearing this, things escalated into a physical altercation where Richard pulled a shotgun on Clarence. The gun was able to be wrestled away from Richard, but then he broke a bottle and threatened to stab Clarence with the jagged glass. In the end, Clarence was injured, and tensions between the family grew. Both parents were soon brought in for a polygraph test. Jane passed and was deemed as truthful. However, Richard's test showed deception. Reports on the test do not state all the questions that had been specifically asked, but Richard claimed that he had failed the test because he felt like he did know what happened to Bobby the day after Christmas. He believed that a specific neighbor had taken Bobby. He showed deception when the questions, "Do you know where Bobby Boys is?" and "What happened to him?" were presented. Richard claimed that this neighbor had threatened him and his family with a shotgun prior over an unknown dispute. This is the same neighbor who had been working on the day of the disappearance and slept on his farm, which authorities were able to verify, and he was not considered a suspect. Officers noted that the parents did not seem overly concerned about their son's disappearance and would often seem cold, even annoyed, at police questioning. Shortly after Bobby's disappearance, sometime between the end of 1968 and 1970, the two-story house on the property had burned down, and the family dog had died in the fire. There are varying accounts on how this happened. Richard stated that the dog had knocked over a lamp on the floor, which led to the fire. However, Bobby's brother John had a different memory. He claimed that he and his older brother had been in the home that afternoon and were playing with fire. He said that the couch caught on fire, and in a panic, the two boys put out the flames and left to go back to their mobile home. He believes that the boys assumed the fire had been put out, but in reality, it must have still been smoldering on the inside of the couch and caught flame again once they left. In recent years, Joy went to the responding fire department to gather information of the fire, but claims that they refused to answer any questions about it. Jane always believed that her husband had started the fire. In July of 1970, Joy approached her mother with a very disturbing story. That month, Jane had been in the hospital giving birth to a baby boy and had stayed in the hospital for a few days. During that time, Joy told her that she had witnessed her father doing something unusual outside their property, but being so young, she didn't know the depravity of what she had witnessed and was simply telling her mother the story. She told Jane that she witnessed her father taking nude photos of underage relatives on a mattress outside the family home. Richard, who dabbled in photography as a hobby, had a dark room in the shed on their property where he would develop photos and hang them to dry. It is unclear whether these photos were ever discovered, but it is known that Richard had kept pornographic photos of minors in the same shed, which he had hidden in December 1968 when the police searched the property for Bobby. This was the final straw for Jane, and she packed up her 5 children and drove them to San Diego, where the family stayed with a relative. Soon after their move, Richard would call Jane and ask her to return the boys to him, and that he, quote, didn't want the girls. Jane refused and divorced Richard. If that wasn't disturbing enough, another memory was recalled that happened in the years leading up to Bobby's disappearance in 1968. Years earlier, when the family was living in Florida, Jane and Richard had briefly separated, and Richard moved out. During this separation, Richard had a 15-year-old boy living with him in his home. It is not known who this boy was, but soon after, Bobby would approach his mother and tell her a story of something that had happened to him. Bobby told Jane that a 15-year-old boy had lured him away and sexually molested him. It is not clear if this was the same 15-year-old boy that was living with Richard at the time in Florida. The FBI got involved when Richard had taken the photos of the underage relatives, and it was also discovered that Richard was showing young boys how to put on condoms. With this new information about Richard, police began to look at him as a possible suspect. Richard's alibi was that he was at work that day. However, some things had counteracted that. First, it was the day after Christmas, and it was probable that Richard would have had the day off from work. However, this was never verified with his employers. Also, a neighbor had seen Richard behind a church around the time that Bobby had disappeared. And most damning, 2 days after Bobby's disappearance, Richard approached someone that he knew asking him to hold on to something, stating, quote, "You'd better keep this." It was Bobby's beloved pocket watch. The investigator who is currently digging into the case said this about Richard giving away the watch. Quote, "There was a few things that were suspicious. For Christmas, Bobby Boyes got a watch, and it was only one day, but he wouldn't take this watch off. Come out to find that 2 or 3 days later, Richard Boyes had this watch on him and gave it to someone else. It was always my suspicion, reading through that case file, that Richard Boyes had something to do with Bobby's disappearance. I couldn't prove that, though, obviously." In her adult years, Joy no longer had a relationship with her father, who had remarried and went on to be the stepfather to 2 boys and having 2 additional kids of his own. She believes that Richard was involved with her older brother's disappearance, and she also believes that her grandmother, Valerie, either knows more about what happened or has a strong suspicion of Richard as well. Whenever Joy would speak to Valerie about Bobby's disappearance, Valerie would tell her to please let it go for now, and that when Valerie passed away, Joy would inherit her money, which she can put towards investigating the case. Richard Boyes died in 1996 at 59 years old, and Jane Boyes died in 2019. The lead investigator, Greg Cameron, visited Richard on his deathbed and pleaded with him to put any information about Bobby's disappearance in his will, but Richard refused, and if he had any information about the whereabouts of his son, it died along with him. When Jane was dying, Joy said that she had begged her mother, and in her own words, was just shy of shaking her and screaming at her to tell her where Bobby could be found, but Jane also refused to share any information with her daughter. Joy said that in this final moment with her mother, she knew that she had upset Jane, but that it was her very last chance to find out any information about where Bobby could be, and she knew that she was running out of chances. Joy still works hard at keeping Bobby's name and memory alive, and hopes to one day learn what happened to him that December day in 1968. Joy stands firm on her suspicions of her father, stating, quote, "I think my father had something to do with it. I can just leave it at that." End quote. Joy stated that she feels isolated in the fact that she's the only one in her family that has been looking for Bobby, and she feels that both her mother and her father took the knowledge of what happened to Bobby to their graves. She said that even to this day, her other siblings refuse to talk about Bobby, and that she is the only one who is still searching, still looking, every single day for her younger brother. She said that as long as she is alive, she will continue to search for answers in Bobby's case. She said this to a news outlet, quote, "I'm on my own, it's just me against the world," end quote. When she was asked if she feels like she will ever get closure about Bobby's case, Joy said, quote, "No, but I'm not going to stop. I'll do whatever anyone asks of me," end quote. When last seen, Bobby Boys was described as standing at 4 feet even, weighing 80 pounds, and wearing a dark blue hooded coat, dark-colored pants, a plaid shirt, and brown leather boots. He had brown hair and brown eyes, and a scar on his upper lip. If he were still alive today, Bobby Boys would be 66 years old. Thank you so much for listening to Across State Lines, and we will be back next week to dive into another unsolved case. Please follow or subscribe to Across State Lines on your podcast listening platform, so that way new episodes will drop directly into your listening feed. If you'd like to rate or review Across State Lines on whatever platform you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and join us again next week.